All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome in. So we have this new report that came out early this morning from ESPN, Jeremy Fowler, and Dan Graziano. Just kind of what they're hearing on the head coaching buzz out there. Obviously, a lot of teams need head coaches. But in regards to the New York Jets, Dan Graziano stated that the three names that he's hearing the most include Mike Vrabel, Aaron Glenn, and Brian Flores. But Graziano, of course, did go on to say that all those guys are drawing interest elsewhere. Glenn and Flores are currently in great situations, so it's possible that the Jets don't get any of the three, which is one of the reasons why they're looking at a bigger pool of candidates. Jeremy Fowler goes on to say, people I've talked to think they will go offense on the coaching side, but some of the strongest candidates are on defense, which could sway things. So let's actually stick with this second part first here, with this whole, should the Jets go offense, should the Jets go defense? There's the sense that I get is that a lot of fans prefer an offensive-minded coach. Why? Because A, the Jets' offense has pretty much been anemic since 2015. B, typically we see teams go in the opposite direction of what they just did, right? So obviously Robert Saleh was a defensive-minded head coach, and you know, I think a lot of people ideally would want to shift things up a little bit and not kind of go into it with the mindset of, okay, well, Brian Flores or Steve Spagnuolo or Aaron Glenn, they're going to be running the defense. But here we are again in this constant search, just like we were under Rex Ryan, just like we were under Todd Bowles, just like we were under Robert Saleh, where it's like, okay, you got to imagine that the defense is going to be handled, but who is going to be the OC? Who's going to be developing the quarterback? Who's going to be, installing the offensive game plan? Who's going to be calling plays? Who's going to be developing offensive players? And when you constantly are in this position where it's just new OC after new OC, if he's good, he's getting plucked. If he's bad, he's getting fired. It's just a weird spot to be. So I completely understand the argument for going after an offensive-minded head coach. And then, of course, on defense, you can argue, all right, well, the Jets' defense has fallen off a cliff. Outside of just a handful of players, there's really not a lot of toughness at all. There's not a lot of physicality. There's not a lot of aggression. You're seeing, weak arm tackling. You're seeing tons of missed tackles. Safeties running right by the ball carrier, just getting burned in open field. We're seeing guys take horrible angles to the ball carrier. It is a lack of pass rush. We're going to need at least a starting defensive tackle. We're going to need edge rusher depth, right? Will McDonald and Jermaine Johnson, is that really enough for the next, for the 2025 defense to rely all of our pass rush on from the outside? We're going to need two starting safeties. What's going to happen at corner two? Linebacker depth, we'll see what happens there. What's the scheme going to be, right? So just from a future projection outlook, yeah, we're going to need someone to step in and have a plan for this defense, because if it's just the same thing as last season, yeah, that's going to be a major problem. So this is where I stand with this whole offense versus defense thing. The number one thing I'm looking for is a culture builder. A leader of men, if you will. And that term gets thrown out a lot. What does it mean? It means someone who's going to walk into the room and command respect from rookies, from guys on their rookie contracts, to veterans, to guys in their late 30s, early 40s. Someone who's going to come in and everyone is well aware, hey, this is the leader. This is the figurehead. This is someone who is going to set the tone, and we're going to follow this guy. That is what the Jets need. That is what the Jets have lacked for a long, long time in numerous seats. I mean, culture with the Jets is just such a big issue. Now, can you flip it entirely? I would say at this point, probably not, because you still have the current ownership structure. And I think for the Jets to have a complete 180 with their culture, they're going to have a situation like Spanos with the Chargers, Dolan with the Knicks, where the owner has the self-awareness to say, I got to switch things up here. Now, of course, that could backfire if you don't hire the right people. Look at the Jacksonville Jaguars. They have an owner that is willing to spend money. They have an owner that is willing to get out of the way. They have an owner that, with other things going on. He's fine just allowing guys to just, build the roster and coach the roster how they want to do it. But the problem is the hires are the wrong ones. But again, going back to the original point, I want someone to come in and change the vibe of the locker room. it doesn't, it bothers me so much that Joe Douglas, that Robert Saleh, that Nathaniel Hackett, that Jeff Ulbrich, no one, Todd Downing to a certain degree, it never really felt as though they were like irritated after a loss. It was just like, it is what it is. That was, and we've talked about that a lot, but that would frustrate the hell out of me, right? When you watch these well-ran teams with established coaches, they are furious after loss. And I'm not saying scream, yell, snip at the media, have these storylines and storm out and throw a tantrum. No, obviously not. People handle things differently. But I would like to see some urgency, especially for Joe Douglas. Like, dude, he was in that seat for 5-6 years, and there was just such a lack of fire. Robert Saleh, I'll give you a year pass. Rookie head coach, starting a rookie quarterback. I get it, right? Year 2, year 3, and where's the fire? Where's the intensity here? Where's just that sense of urgency? Like, man, losing is just not acceptable here. I want to coach like that. So again, in this whole offensive mind versus defensive mind, I'm not personally going to pigeonhole myself if I was Woody Johnson and say, you know what, we need that offensive mind. But if Aaron Glenn comes in and just hits an absolute home run in the interview, and you think that, he's going to change the culture coming in from Detroit, being around great coaches, playing for this organization, and the Jets go with Arthur Smith because he's an offensive mind and the Jets prefer an offensive mind, I would have a major issue with that. But again, I'm not the one heading up the search. Of course, you could have a preference, right? I would prefer maybe an offensive guy. I'd prefer maybe a defensive guy. But I think for me, the culture has just been talked about and reported on so much with this Jets team. I just think that should be the number one priority, right? Get someone to come in who is not going to be rattled, not going to be shaken by the media or the market size or the ownership. I want to see the coach hired with the Jets that's going to implement the culture, that's going to change the attitude, someone who is going to understand the value and the importance of building a staff, adding these veteran coaches, right? Maybe plucking former head coaches to fill your coordinator roles so you have that extra experience, providing that hard-nosed, physical, aggressive mentality, right? The Jets just lack that, and it's like my favorite thing in football. So that's kind of where I stand with this whole, which side do I prefer? I kind of am looking at those two things as a branch off of a bigger tree, which is, again, changing the attitude with this organization because, damn, we desperately need it. Now, in regards to Aaron Glenn, Brian Flores, and Mike Vrabel being the three names that ESPN or Dan Graziano is hearing the most around, right, the most buzz, I would say out of those three right now, Aaron Glenn would probably be the favorite. I'm going to, suggest that Mike Vrabel probably goes to the New England Patriots. It kind of feels like 95% of people feel that way unless there's some situation with maybe the Jaguars or the Raiders that can sway Vrabel's opinion. But everything is just lining up for Mike Vrabel to take that. He's actually interviewing with the Patriots later on today. But in any case, I don't want to be that guy, but it just feels like Vrabel at this point's a long shot. So we're looking at the next two, Aaron Glenn, Brian Flores, and we have to ask the question, what are the connections, right? If the Jets go out and hire Ryan Grigson from the Minnesota Vikings, I think Brian Flores becomes the favorite. I do, right? Those two guys are tight. There was actually an article released on their working relationship. These guys seem to be moving in lockstep together. And that is really, really important. As we all know, there has to be a continuity between general manager and head coach. Think of it like a three-legged race. You can't have one guy stumbling around, messing around. No, they have to be on the same page, moving in the right direction. And the Jets have expressed interest in Ryan Grigson and Brian Flores. The Jets will be interviewing both of those candidates. Now, the Ryan Grigson interview can take place whenever, because with general manager candidates, obviously we don't have to wait until the Vikings get bounced from the playoffs. So the Jets can sit down with Grigson, former GM experience, handful of years with the Indianapolis Colts, started great. Win-loss record is actually really impressive, but then it tailed off, and there's major question marks about the latter drafts, the question of depth on the roster, the Andrew Luck retirement, never really providing him with a lot of help on the offense side of the football. Lots of questions with Ryan Grigson. But again, I do think if he walks in and impresses and gets that job, Brian Flores instantly shoots up to the top of the list as the number one favorite. And then in regards to Aaron Glenn, there hasn't been much buzz with Ray Agnew as a potential general manager option, but the Jets put in a request yesterday to interview Chris Spielman, Rick Spielman's little brother, former longtime Detroit Lion, fantastic player, former longtime game announcer, right? So Spielman's been around this game for a long, long time, and this is actually his first kind of front office gig with the Detroit Lions, and we know what the Lions blueprint has been, right? Former players, Mark Brunell, Aaron Glenn, Dan Campbell. You could talk about Deuce Staley, right, when he was there. All of these different Chris Spielman, right? Getting that player background into the mix. And we look back at Spielman's playing career. Obviously, it was a little bit before my time, but going back and watching and listening to how good of a player Spielman was, he was hard nosed, he was physical, an old school mind. And he has a pretty big role with the Detroit Lions. Now, I'm not going to sit here and credit Chris Spielman for everything, right? Obviously, Detroit, I think, is a perfect example of a team that has so many different contributors. That's how we've seen such an incredible turnaround, such an incredible just performance week in and week out. I mean, this is a 15-win team. Think about that for a second. 15 wins. 1 seed in the NFC. Tons of great teams. Philly, Minnesota, Green Bay, all these good football teams. And Detroit is just, they've separated themselves. In other words, the Lions have a fantastic culture. They have a winning culture, a physical culture. I love that. And, again, Chris Spielman's a part of it. I also think that Chris Spielman would come into the New York Jets being interviewed by his brother here. So you obviously have that chemistry. I think if Rick Spielman didn't think Chris was a good fit, he would just be like, let's not waste our time here. Right? We got to interview all these different candidates. Chris has a great gig over in Detroit. Why, if it's not a good fit, why would I step in trying to ruin that, sabotage it? If I knew Chris and Woody weren't going to get along, then it just makes zero sense. So I do think internally, at least from the 33rd team's side of it, I don't know how Woody and Chris Johnson feel, but they believe that there's obvious interest there. And because of that, it needs to be taken seriously. I think Spielman would come in and have that attitude, have that mentality. I'm not being bullied by Woody Johnson. I'm not being bullied by storylines and headlines and articles that come out. Like I just don't foresee someone like Chris Spielman getting worked like that. I think he's going to come in and own the room. He's a good example of a leader of men. And of course, Spielman again, Detroit Lions, Aaron Glenn. We all know all of the different connections with Aaron Glenn. So we'll see. We'll see how this goes, right? Again, I don't feel great about Vrabel at this point in time. But with Aaron Glenn and Brian Flores, the Jets have requested to interview both. Ryan Grigson, Minnesota Vikings. There's also been interest in Josh McCown. The Jets are doing their due diligence. They are casting a wide net. That is really, really important. You never know what coordinator, you never know what ex-head coach is going to walk through the door and just blow you away. You never know. That's why these interviews are so, so important. So until we start getting these second interviews scheduled, that's when we know, okay, hey, there is serious interest here. Because again, with this wide net being casted, the guys that are getting second interviews did a really good job and are separating themselves from the pack. So anyway, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section on this report. And as always, go Jets.